August 23, 1945, Tokyo Bay, Japan. The morning fog clung to the water like a shroud, partially obscuring the massive silhouette of the USS Missouri, anchored less than 1,000 yards from shore. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida stood on the deck of a small transport vessel, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he and 4 other Japanese naval officers approached what would soon become the site of their nation's formal surrender. What these officers believed would be a simple preparatory inspection before the signing ceremony would instead become a profound revelation that would haunt them for decades to come. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how 5 of Japan's most decorated naval officers, architects of some of the most daring operations in naval history, came face to face with the industrial might that had defeated them, forcing them to confront not just the material superiority of their adversary, but the fundamental miscalculations that had doomed their nation's war effort from its very beginning. The small vessel bobbed in the choppy waters as it approached the massive warship. Captain Fuchida adjusted his cap, studying the enormous vessel with professional interest. At 47 years old, Fuchida was among Japan's most experienced naval aviators. He had led the first wave attack on Pearl Harbor nearly 4 years earlier and had survived the devastating defeat at Midway. Now, in the twilight of an empire, he had been tasked with this final, humbling assignment. "It seems even larger up close," remarked Commander Minoru Genda, standing beside him. Genda, the brilliant tactical planner behind many Japanese naval operations, had spent years studying American carriers. The Essex class. This one must be among their newest. "Actually, Commander," the American liaison officer corrected politely, "the Missouri is a Iowa-class battleship, not an aircraft carrier. You'll be seeing one of our carriers tomorrow." Fuchida and Genda exchanged glances. Even after years of conflict, there was still confusion about American vessel classifications. The sheer number and variety of American warships had always presented an intelligence challenge. Also present were Captain Toshikazu Omae, a strategic planning expert, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, a naval engineer, and Rear Admiral Sadatoshi Tomioka, formerly of the Imperial Navy General Staff. Each had been selected not just to prepare for the surrender ceremony, but to gather final intelligence on American naval capabilities, information that would never be used for war, but might help explain how their once proud Navy had been so thoroughly defeated. As they boarded the Missouri, they were greeted by Captain Stuart Murray, the ship's commanding officer. "Gentlemen, welcome aboard. I understand you're here to familiarize yourselves with the surrender ceremony arrangements, but my orders permit me to give you a limited tour of non-sensitive areas as well. Please follow me." The Japanese officers removed their caps as they stepped onto the gleaming deck. The Missouri was immaculate, its teak decking scrubbed to perfection, its brass fixtures gleaming in the morning sun that had begun burning through the fog. The American sailors they passed stood at their posts with disciplined precision, though Fuchida noticed many eyeing them with undisguised curiosity or barely concealed hostility. "This vessel was commissioned in June 1944, Captain Murray explained as they walked. "She's the 4th Iowa-class battleship, displacing 57,000 tons fully loaded, with a maximum speed exceeding 33 knots. Lieutenant Commander Tanabe, the engineer, could not hide his professional admiration. 57,000 tons, yet capable of 33 knots. Our Yamato displaced 72,000 tons, but could achieve only 27 knots at maximum." Murray nodded. "Our propulsion system delivers 212,000 shaft horsepower to 4 screws, but you gentlemen aren't here to discuss technical specifications. The surrender ceremony will take place here, on this very deck." As they continued their tour, Rear Admiral Tomioka asked carefully measured questions about the ship's construction time. Murray answered without hesitation. From keel laying to commission was just over 19 months. Tomioka's expression remained neutral, but Fuchida knew what his colleague was thinking. Their own Yamato, Japan's pride, had required nearly 5 years from keel laying to commission. And here was a comparable American vessel, completed in less than half that time. "Captain Murray," Genda inquired, How many Iowa-class battleships were completed during the conflict? 4 entered service, with 2 more under construction when the war ended, Murray replied. But battleships are now secondary to our carrier forces. And how many carriers does your Navy currently operate? Omai asked, his voice casual but his eyes intent. Murray seemed to consider how much to reveal, then apparently decided the war's end made secrecy unnecessary. Including all types, Essex-class fleet carriers, Independence-class light carriers, escort carriers, and our older vessels, we currently have more than 100 aircraft carriers in commission. The number struck the Japanese officers like a physical blow. 100 carriers. Japan had begun the war with 10 carriers and had managed to build only 6 more during the entire conflict. Even at their peak, they had never operated more than 16. And now the Americans spoke of 100 as if it were an unremarkable figure. There must be some misunderstanding, Tanabe said carefully. Perhaps you include small escort vessels in this count. I do include our Casablanca and Commencement Bay-class escort carriers, Murray confirmed. But we have completed or nearly completed 24 Essex-class fleet carriers alone, each capable of operating between 90 and 100 aircraft. The Japanese officers fell silent. 24 fleet carriers, each roughly equivalent to the Shokaku or Zuikaku that had struck Pearl Harbor. And that was just one class of carrier. Captain, Fuchida finally asked, would it be possible to visit one of your Essex-class carriers? For the historical record, of course. Murray consulted with a staff officer briefly. As it happens, the USS Bennington is anchored nearby. I'll arrange a brief visit for tomorrow if my superiors approve. Now, shall we continue with the surrender ceremony preparations? The remainder of their visit to the Missouri was conducted in a fog of distraction for the Japanese officers. They dutifully noted the arrangements for the surrender ceremony, where the Japanese delegation would stand, where the Allied representatives would be positioned, where the documents would be signed. But their minds were racing with calculations and implications. That evening, in their temporary quarters ashore, the 5 officers gathered to discuss what they had learned. They spoke in hushed tones, though they knew their quarters were likely monitored. 100 carriers, Omai repeated, still struggling to accept the figure. Even if we count their smallest escort vessels, the number is simply incomprehensible. Not incomprehensible, Tomioka corrected. Just beyond our initial estimates. Naval intelligence projected American production capacity at perhaps 40 to 50 carriers for the duration of a prolonged conflict. It seems we underestimated by half. Gender, always the tactician, shook his head. It was never about specific numbers. Even our most optimistic war plans acknowledged American industrial superiority. Our strategy relied on a negotiated peace after early decisive victories. A fundamental miscalculation, Fuchida said quietly. We planned for a limited war against an opponent capable of waging total war. The next morning found them aboard a different transport vessel, this time approaching the USS Bennington, an Essex-class carrier that had been commissioned in August 1944, just 8 months before the end of hostilities in Europe. As they drew nearer, the massive scale of the vessel became apparent. Nearly 900 feet in length, with a flight deck that seemed to stretch endlessly, the Bennington dwarfed any carrier Japan had ever built. They were greeted by Commander James Rogers, the carrier's executive officer. Welcome aboard, gentlemen. Captain Goodwin sends his regrets, but operational matters require his attention. I'll be conducting your tour today. The Japanese officers were escorted up to the flight deck, where dozens of aircraft sat in neat rows. Corsairs, Hellcats, Avengers, aircraft that had dominated the skies over the Pacific in the war's later years. How many aircraft does the Bennington typically carry? Asked Gender. Our current complement is 91 aircraft, Rogers replied. 37 Hellcat fighters, 34 Helldiver dive bombers, and 20 Avenger torpedo bombers. 91 aircraft on a single carrier, the Shokaku, one of Japan's largest carriers, had carried 72 at maximum capacity. And there were 24 Essex-class carriers. As they toured the enormous vessel, Lieutenant Commander Tanabe paid particular attention to construction details. The compartmentalization is impressive, he noted as they moved through the interior spaces, and the damage control systems appear more extensive than our own designs. Our damage control proved critical in several engagements, Rogers confirmed. The Franklin, another Essex class, absorbed damage that would have sunk any other nation's carrier, yet made it home under her own power. Fuchida remembered the Franklin incident well. American carriers hit by Japanese aircraft had survived damage that would have sent Japanese carriers to the bottom. It wasn't just the quantity of American ships that had proven decisive, but their quality and resilience as well. Their tour continued through the cavernous hangar deck, where aircraft maintenance was underway. The sheer scale of operations was staggering, dozens of planes being serviced simultaneously by hundreds of specialized technicians. "How long did the Bennington take to build?" Omai asked as they observed the activity. 14 months from keel laying to commissioning, Rogers replied, and she wasn't our fastest. Some Essex-class carriers were completed in just over a year. 14 months. The Japanese officers exchanged glances. Their own largest carriers had required 3 to 4 years of construction time, and the Americans had built 24 Essex-class carriers in roughly 3 years. As they continued their tour, they reached the carriers' machine shops. Here Tanabe stopped in amazement. The shops were equipped with precision tools that would have been the envy of many Japanese naval yards. Lathes, milling machines, welding equipment, all installed on a ship. "You can manufacture replacement parts aboard?" he asked incredulously. "Within certain limitations, yes," Rogers confirmed. "Our machine shops can fabricate many components without requiring shipyard support. It extends our operational range and time between major maintenance periods. Self-sufficiency at sea. Another American advantage that had proven decisive in the vast Pacific theater, where logistics and supply lines stretched thousands of miles. When they reached the mess facilities, they were invited to observe lunch service for the crew. Long lines of sailors moved efficiently through serving areas, emerging with trays laden with food, fresh bread, meat, vegetables, even ice cream. The portions were generous, the variety impressive. "Your sailors eat this way every day?" Admiral Tomioka asked, unable to hide his surprise. 3 meals daily, as Rogers confirmed. Nutrition is considered essential to combat effectiveness. Fuchida thought of Japan's sailors in the war's final months, surviving on reduced rice rations, suffering from malnutrition and related illnesses. The contrast could not have been more stark. The tour concluded with a visit to the Flight Deck Operations Center, where the complex choreography of launching and recovering aircraft was explained. Throughout the carrier, they observed an operation of breathtaking complexity, managed with apparent ease, the product of standardized training, clear procedures, and extensive experience. As they prepared to depart, Commander Rogers made an offhand comment that would haunt the Japanese officers. "The Bennington is actually hull number 20 in our Essex program. We're expecting hull 24 to commission next month, and that's just one carrier class." Back on their transport vessel, the 5 Japanese officers were uncharacteristically silent. Each was processing what they had seen, reconciling it with their understanding of the conflict they had just lost. That evening they gathered again in their quarters. The mood was somber, reflective. "We never had a chance," Omai finally said, breaking the silence. "Not after the first 6 months. Perhaps not even then," Tomioka replied. "Their industrial mobilization was already underway when we struck Pearl Harbor. Even had we destroyed their carriers there, the outcome might have been merely delayed, not changed." Gender, who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, nodded slowly. "Our greatest victory laid the foundation for our defeat. We awakened their industrial potential and united their people against us. It wasn't just quantity," Tanabe added. "Their damage control, their maintenance capabilities, their logistical systems, all superior to our own. A single Essex carrier represents more industrial and technical capacity than our largest naval yard." Fuchida had been quiet, but now he spoke. "Tomorrow, we observe the surrender ceremony. But today we witnessed why that surrender became inevitable, not because our sailors lacked courage or skill, but because we engaged in a contest of production against the world's greatest industrial power." The next day, September 2nd, 1945, the formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the USS Missouri. The 5 officers who had toured the American vessels stood among the Japanese delegation, watching as Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender, followed by General Yoshijiro Umezu. From their position, they could see the massive array of American warships filling Tokyo Bay: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and yes, aircraft carriers. An armada so vast it seemed to stretch to the horizon, representing just a fraction of the American naval power that had swept across the Pacific. As the ceremony concluded, Fuchida found himself standing near Douglas MacArthur. The American general studied him for a moment, then asked, "You're Fuchida, aren't you? The pilot who led the Pearl Harbor attack?" "Yes, General," Fuchida replied, surprised to be recognized. MacArthur nodded thoughtfully. "You started a war we finished. I wonder what you've learned from that." Fuchida considered his response carefully. "That the world has changed, General. Naval power is no longer measured in battleships and tactics, but in factories and oil fields." MacArthur seemed to approve of the answer. "Indeed. Remember that lesson, Captain. The age of industrial warfare has arrived. The events of those 3 days in Tokyo Bay would be scrutinized by Japanese military analysts for decades to come. The 5 officers who had witnessed American naval might firsthand would go on to play significant roles in post-war Japan's reassessment of its military strategy and industrial policy. Captain Fuchida would later write in his memoirs, "Standing on the deck of the American carrier, I finally understood what Admiral Yamamoto had meant when he cautioned against war with the United States. He had studied there and seen their industrial heartland. He knew what I only learned too late, that American shipyards could produce vessels faster than we could sink them. Our war was lost before it began, not on tactical grounds but on industrial capacity." Commander Genda, who would later help establish Japan's post-war air self-defense force, drew different lessons. "The Americans did not simply outproduce us. They outtrained us, outorganized us, and out-innovated us. Their carriers did not just carry more aircraft, they operated them more efficiently, maintained them more effectively, and replaced losses more quickly. It was a system we could not match." Rear Admiral Tomioka, in classified reports that would only be declassified decades later, provided a stark assessment. Japan's naval strategy was fundamentally flawed by its failure to account for American industrial potential. We measured our strength against their deployed forces rather than their production capacity. By the time we recognized our error, our position was already irretrievable. Lieutenant Commander Tanabe would go on to work in Japan's post-war shipbuilding industry, helping to transform Japanese industrial practices based on what he had observed aboard American vessels. The Americans had achieved something we had not: the perfect marriage of mass production and quality control. Their vessels were built quickly, yet finished to exceptional standards. This approach would later become the foundation of Japan's economic revival. Captain Omai perhaps summarized it most succinctly in a lecture to Japan's post-war defense academy. "We lost the war on the drafting tables of Pittsburgh and the assembly lines of California long before we lost it in the waters of the Philippine Sea or the Marianas." The industrial disparity revealed during those inspections told only part of the story, however. American success had been built on more than just factory output. It reflected a society fully mobilized for war production, where civilian factories had been rapidly converted to military use, where women had entered the workforce by the millions, and where standardization and innovation had been systematically pursued. The American naval construction program represented an industrial achievement unprecedented in human history. Between Pearl Harbor and victory over Japan Day, American shipyards had delivered 12 fleet carriers, 14 light carriers, and 65 escort carriers, a total of 91 aircraft carriers. During the same period, they had also produced 8 battleships, 48 cruisers, 349 destroyers, and nearly 450 submarines. For the Japanese officers who had begun the war believing in their qualitative superiority, these figures were incomprehensible. Japan's total wartime production of naval vessels represented less than 15% of American output. In aircraft, the disparity was even greater. Japan produced approximately 76,000 aircraft during the entire conflict, while American factories delivered over 300,000. This production miracle had been achieved through innovation as well as scale. The construction time for an Essex-class carrier had been reduced from 25 months for the earliest vessels to under 15 months for later ships. Liberty ships, the backbone of America's maritime supply chain, saw their construction time reduced from initially 240 days to eventually just 2 weeks per ship. Behind these production statistics lay other numbers equally significant. America's wartime steel production reached 89 million tons in 1944 alone, more than 6 times Japan's production during the entire war. Oil production, critical for naval operations, saw America producing 231 million barrels monthly, while Japan struggled to import 4 million barrels monthly even before Allied submarine campaigns severed their supply lines. One oil field in East Texas produced more petroleum than all the territories controlled by the Japanese Empire combined. These industrial realities had shaped the strategic options available to both sides throughout the conflict. Japan had begun the war knowing it could not match American production, but hoping to secure a negotiated peace before that production could be fully mobilized. The Japanese strategy had relied on a limited war. America had responded with total war. For the 5 Japanese naval officers who had witnessed American naval might firsthand in Tokyo Bay, these realizations transformed their understanding not just of their defeat, but of modern warfare itself. The age of industrial warfare had arrived, and with it new requirements for national defense. In the decades that followed, Japan would rebuild its economy based in part on lessons learned from American wartime production. Standardization, quality control, efficient supply chain management, and the integration of design and manufacturing processes. The economic miracle that transformed post-war Japan from devastation to industrial powerhouse had its roots, ironically, in the very American systems that had ensured Japan's defeat. The ultimate irony was not lost on Fuchida and his colleagues. The industrial methods that had defeated them would eventually become the foundation of Japan's post-war economic revival. Japan's transition from wartime enemy to peacetime economic competitor would be built on principles observed during those sobering tours of American vessels in Tokyo Bay. As the American occupation of Japan proceeded, further revelations emerged about the scale of American industrial mobilization. The United States had not just built ships and aircraft. It had transformed its entire economy for war production. Automobile factories had been converted to produce aircraft. Civilian shipyards expanded to many times their peacetime capacity, and new manufacturing techniques developed to speed production while maintaining quality. Perhaps most impressively, much of this industrial miracle had been achieved while simultaneously supplying the Soviet Union and Great Britain through Lend-Lease programs. America had outproduced the combined Axis powers while also serving as the arsenal of democracy for its allies. For Japan, which had entered the war with limited industrial capacity and dwindling resource reserves, the contrast could not have been more stark. Japanese strategic planning had focused on maximizing existing advantages rather than developing new capabilities. Their naval doctrine had emphasized quality over quantity, the decisive battle over sustained campaigns, and tactical brilliance over logistical superiority. These approaches had brought initial success, but proved inadequate against an opponent that simply refused to accept a limited war or a negotiated peace. American strategy had been one of attrition, trading space for time, absorbing initial defeats while building overwhelming force, then applying that force relentlessly across the Pacific. The Essex-class carriers that so impressed the Japanese officers were just one component of this strategy. These vessels, displacing over 33,000 tons and carrying nearly 100 aircraft each, had formed the backbone of the American fast carrier task forces that dominated the Pacific in the war's final years. With their 16 5-inch guns, numerous anti-aircraft weapons, and comprehensive damage control systems, they were offensive and defensive powerhouses. But beyond their individual capabilities, it was their production in such numbers that proved decisive. The 24 Essex-class carriers, commissioned or nearly completed by war's end, represented more fleet carrier capacity than all other navies in the world combined. And they had been produced while simultaneously building dozens of smaller carriers, hundreds of destroyers, and thousands of landing craft. The human element of this production miracle was equally impressive. American shipyards had employed nearly 1,800,000 workers at their peak, many of them previously unskilled, many of them women entering industrial work for the first time. These workers had achieved productivity levels previously thought impossible. At the Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond, California, a Liberty ship was constructed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes, an achievement celebrated with nationwide publicity. While this was a special case designed to demonstrate American productive capability, regular production times had still been reduced to weeks rather than months for these essential transport vessels. For the Japanese officers who had devoted their careers to naval strategy and operations, these revelations forced a fundamental reassessment of warfare itself. Modern conflict, they now understood, was not decided primarily by tactical brilliance or even strategic insight, but by industrial capacity, resource availability, and logistical systems. In his final report before the Japanese naval staff was dissolved, Admiral Tomioka wrote, "The lesson of this conflict is clear. Naval power in the modern age rests ultimately not on the skill of sailors or the courage of aviators, but on the capacity of shipyards, the output of factories, and the production of steel and oil. Without industrial supremacy, tactical and operational excellence can delay defeat, but cannot secure victory." This lesson was not lost on post-war Japanese planners. As Japan rebuilt under American occupation, it adopted and adapted many American industrial methods. The Toyota production system, which would later revolutionize global manufacturing, incorporated lessons from American wartime production, along with innovations developed to address Japan's specific circumstances. Japan's post-war economic miracle would see the nation transform itself from a defeated military power to an economic superpower in the span of a few decades. This transformation was built on many of the same principles that had underpinned America's wartime production success: standardization, quality control, efficient supply chains, and continuous improvement. For Captain Fuchida, the journey would be even more profound. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor would later convert to Christianity and spend decades traveling America as an evangelist and peace advocate. He would write in his autobiography, "Looking back, I now realize that even had we achieved our most optimistic military goals in 1941 and 42, the industrial reality of America would have eventually overcome us. The war was decided not by battles, but by factories." The USS Bennington that had so impressed the Japanese officers would continue serving in the U.S. Navy until 1970, undergoing modernization to operate jet aircraft and eventually participating in the recovery of Apollo 7 astronauts. One of 24 Essex-class carriers, she represented American industrial might, translated into global naval power, the very force that had made American victory inevitable once the nation fully mobilized for war. In the decades following World War II, as nuclear weapons transformed strategic calculations and aircraft carriers evolved to launch jets rather than propeller aircraft, the fundamental lesson observed by those 5 Japanese officers in Tokyo Bay remained valid. Industrial capacity, technological innovation, and resource availability ultimately determine military potential. Today, as nations once again assess their relative military strengths and strategic positions, that lesson from Tokyo Bay still resonates. Modern naval power, like its World War II predecessor, rests not just on the ships that float in harbors or the aircraft that fly from their decks, but on the industrial infrastructure that builds them, the economic system that sustains them, and the resource base that fuels them. The 5 Japanese naval officers who toured American vessels in those fateful days of early September 1945 saw more than impressive warships. They witnessed the dawn of a new age in warfare, an age where industrial capacity translated directly into military power, where factories proved as decisive as fleets, and where production lines ultimately proved more important than front lines. Their experience reminds us that wars are not won solely by courage, skill, or tactical brilliance, but by the sustained application of industrial might. It is a lesson written not just in military histories, but in the steel hulls of warships, the production statistics of factories, and the memories of those who witnessed American industrial power firsthand in Tokyo Bay. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.